Hola, this is Angelica Negron, answering some questions for Ensemble for these times. I started playing piano when I was young, around 7, and I would mostly play the songs from Disney musicals, like Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and a little bit of classical, but just mostly those Disney tunes. And then I started playing violin. I started the Conservatory of Music in Puerto Rico, which is where I was born and raised. And I played in orchestras my whole life, and I always loved the violin, but never saw myself as a concert violinist. But I just kept doing it because I really loved music. But I was really curious about the sounds around me and the environment, also really curious about the other instruments in the orchestra. But I just didn't know what that meant for me. I always played music by dead white men. And even though I obviously had a love for that music and I enjoyed playing it, there was always this kind of missing piece, that my curiosity as a person was not really being fulfilled in the music I was making. So I started playing music in bands, mostly very active in the DIY scene in San Juan, in Puerto Rico, and started making my own music while I was also studying violin. And then around that same time, I started studying film in the University of Puerto Rico. That's where I met a lot of my friends that I was making music with. And through films, I discovered film music, and then through film music, I discovered the music of living composers. At the same time, also, I was listening to a lot of Bang on a Can records, Kronos Quartet, just a lot of discoveries of things that were really important for me as an artist. And through that, I realized that there were living people making music, and that my curiosity for the sounds around me and for other instruments did not mean that I just wasn't sure what instrument I wanted to play and that I was lost as a performer, but mostly that what I wanted to do was to write for all these instruments. And also at the same time found out that there was a composition department in the conservatory. It was very small. It was all male at that time. So I joined the composition department. I switched from violin to composing. And yeah, and that was it. I kind of never looked back after that. I'm really inspired by whatever is around me, my family, my friends, my students, people I don't know, nature, sounds from nature, and how they're connected to a specific place and memory and time. I'm also really inspired by comedy and sounds from really everywhere. Domestic sounds from my apartment, my kitchen, the way a specific person laughs, the way someone talks. It really could be anything that sparks an idea. I do have a kind of special interest, or I'm really drawn to non-conventional sound makers and also objects from childhood, like music boxes, toys. And more than anything, I feel like that's a connection to not only nostalgia, but there's also a sense of irreverence that is inherent in those objects and those instruments. And I'm really interested in tapping into that, and in a way accessing another side of them and playing with what happens when we take these sort of mundane objects, or objects that a lot of their identity relies in not being professional, and then put them in a professional setting, and what happens when they overlap with more traditional instruments. and also all the possibilities for manipulating sounds and taking a sound that could have very specific associations to someone, but then what happens if I take out an important part of the sound, like the attack, for example, and leave the resonance, and what transformations can come out of that. My compositional process is very visual. I often start with an image. It could be something very specific, like a painting, a word, but it could also be just a texture or a color or a feeling, just something pretty evocative in my head that can then start the process of capturing ideas and developing them in a way that feels satisfying to me. I I then almost always collect sounds either from the environment or from my house or samples from other pieces that I've written in the past and create a sound library for the specific piece and then start playing around with those sounds. So I almost always, if the piece is electronics, almost always starting with the electronics and playing around with manipulating and processing those sounds and seeing what the sounds want to do in this piece. And then from there it's a pretty intuitive and organic process in which I'm just following my ears and trying to not think so much about theory or chord progressions or rhythm in an intellectual way, and more following my intuition and writing something that I'd like to hear. That's a really good question. I think for a long time I kept those worlds separate, and that did not feel right. I was making music with balloon, and I was writing very different kind of music for the concert hall, and very purposefully separated those worlds. And I would say about 12 years ago, I started not caring so much about that and about putting things in separate containers and just being more fluid and embracing the totality of who I am as an artist as my true self. And that was really liberating. So I right now don't think about those distinctions. They pretty much all live together in the same part of my brain, and also what I do in Balloon, which is collaborative because I'm making music with my best friends. It's also a really big part of the work I write for chamber ensembles and orchestras, and the work I write for myself to play solo using plants or vegetables. It's all, I think, combined and infiltrates sometimes in ways that I don't even realize until I've had some distance with the music and then come back to it, and then I'm like, oh, that clarinet part is actually, I don't know, something that Nora would play. Nora, who plays cuatro and bass in balloon, that's something that Nora could play in a balloon song and come up with that. So I think my experience in those bands has been really formative and really influential in my other compositions for other people. Sueño Recurrente, it's a piece that I wrote a long time ago. It's, if not my first, my second piece that I ever wrote. It's very influenced by Satie. I'm a huge fan, and Satie was one of those composers that really inspired me. This kind of very unapologetic simplicity, while at the same time having a sense of irreverence and at the same time being incredibly meaningful. Just, I don't know how he does it. Um, but yeah, Sueños Recurrentes is very much inspired by Satie and also by recurrent dreams I was having at that time. I kept dreaming about these cars that were flying, and I would think of them as ghost cars. I really don't know what that means, but just this thing that keeps coming back in your dreams. and then you try to make some sense of it, but maybe that's not what it wants. It just exists, and it's an image that stays with you. I think I'm looking forward to the conversation moving forward in a way that is more connected to sustainability and support and community. And especially now, thinking about a lot of artists of color getting more commissions and more performances and more works, because since last year's racial uprising, there's been an obvious shift in the programming, especially in major organizations like orchestras, and realizing that we exist and we're here, and we have things to say. So I think I'm interested in when that happens in a way that is not a natural progression, or it's not something that has been at a pace that feels normal. It just feels like all of a sudden for some organizations. I'm interested in the conversations that we need to have about how can we make that sustainable, and how we can best support artists to make the art they want to make. Not commission them to write about their trauma, not commission them to write something about being an artist of color. Having this openness that we have for other artists be the same for us. And I also want to talk more with colleagues about how do we make sure that once we're invited in places that have historically been excluding us, how we can make sure that we're treated with respect, and that we can also find ways to invite other folks that haven't been invited in those spaces. I think it's really important that faculties in universities, conservatories, and summer camps and programs, administration and organizations, it's really important that all of those look like the world we live in, and that they reflect all the different perspectives and the different backgrounds of people. That's unfortunately not the case, and we are mostly in a white male dominated culture. So there's that lack of balance. It can have a lot of consequences for students and young artists when they enter into these spaces. And I think it's really important to have role models and teachers that share our background and heritage. At the same time, that is a small part of who we are as an artist. For some people, it's bigger, for some people, it's smaller, but it is not the totality of who we are as artists and as humans. So I think it's important to have the option, but at the same time, it's, for me at least, even more important to consider the multiplicity of identity, and that there are many interests that people have, and that there are other factors that come into play when you are looking for a role model, or when you're looking for a mentor or a teacher, and that your heritage is an important part of that makeup, but it's just an element from that totality. I would say make the work that you want to make. I know it sounds very simple, but for a long time I struggled with that. I was not making work that I wanted to listen to. I was making music the music that I thought other people wanted me to make. And I don't mean audiences, I mean mostly in school, just overthinking music that would be interesting to talk about, or that I could talk about the different operations I did to a a certain group of notes or a scale or the chord progression I use or those things are obviously great technical resources and are also things that are really important for some composers, but not for everyone. I feel like finding the thing that feels right for you, the thing you're most excited about, and then pursuing that and trying your best to let go of all the voices that tell you otherwise. And never forget to have fun.